The encounter with the lords of karma does not occur in the instant following physical death, as certain simplified representations might suggest. Rudolf Steiner taught that the clairvoyant investigation of the Akashic records reveals a precise and technically determined sequence of steps that any spiritual self goes through between the moment of death and the much more distant moment where it actually comes face to face with these supervising entities, a sequence that involves passage through different spiritual fields corresponding to the planetary spheres that ancient esoteric cosmology already recognized, although without the precise technical detail that spiritual science later articulated. Steiner revealed that the first stage of this extensive journey involves a period he called Kamaloka, a word of Sanskrit origin that literally means the place of desire, a period where the spiritual self, still closely linked to the impulses and desires that characterized its recently concluded physical existence, goes through a process of progressive liberation from these instinctive bonds through an extremely detailed and extremely precise retrospective experience of its entire recently completed biography. Steiner taught that this specific retrospective experience differs fundamentally from simple memory or conscious recollection, comparable to that which any living person can exercise about his or her own past, because it involves a complete and perfectly detailed reliving of every significant moment of completed existence, but traversed in chronologically reversed order, beginning with the most recent events and progressively moving back through time, until finally reaching the earliest memories of one's own childhood. Steiner taught that this perception of inverted time during the passage through the Kamaloka represents a specific technical phenomenon that deserves a careful explanation, because common ordinary consciousness, conditioned by the experience of temporal flow, always directed from the past to the future, often has difficulty understanding how exactly this retrograde perception that characterizes this particular phase of the post-death process works. The specific experience involves not a simple mechanical and disordered reproduction of memories in reverse sequence, but something qualitatively different, the spiritual self reliving each previous significant situation, but now from the perspective of the effect that its own specific actions have produced on other beings involved. A perception that ordinary consciousness during physical life, focused predominantly on its own sensations and its own immediate needs, rarely achieves with equal clarity and equal completeness. Steiner revealed that this inverted perception focused on the effect produced on others, rather than simply on one's own original subjective experience, is precisely what makes this period so important and so technically necessary within the entire broader process, because it allows the spiritual self to understand, with clarity that no reflection during ordinary physical life could equal, exactly the real and complete consequences of each choice and each action carried out throughout the entire newly concluded existence. Steiner taught that the specific duration of this period of Kamaloka corresponds, according to the precise technical principle that clairvoyant investigation identifies, to approximately 1/3 of the total duration of the physical life that has just concluded, a proportion that is not arbitrary, but reflects a fundamental spiritual relationship between the time necessary for adequate retrospective purification and the time that the specific physical existence itself had consumed in its complete duration. Steiner taught that throughout this process of retrospective purification, the astral body, that aspect of the human constitution that sustains desires, passions, and instinctive impulses, goes through what could be described as a process of progressive combustion, or gradual unraveling of the structures that most closely connected the spiritual self to the purely material and purely selfish attachments that had characterized its recently concluded physical existence. There is a detail about this topic that few people realize. According to Rudolf Steiner, the question is not just who decides the destiny of the soul. The question is, on what basis would this decision be made? Because if there is a spiritual logic behind the next incarnation, then every experience in life can have a much greater meaning than it appears, and this possibility completely changes the way we see our own destiny. If you want to explore this perspective more deeply, the material is in the description link and in the pinned comment. This specific combustion of the astral body does not represent a violent or painfully destructive process in the sense that the word combustion might suggest to the common imagination, but rather a transformation, a gradual and necessarily liberating action, where what still kept the spiritual self artificially tied to desires and attachments that no longer correspond to its current disembodied circumstances is progressively dissolved, creating space so that the spiritual self can advance adequately to the subsequent stages of this broader journey. Steiner revealed that different specific types of attachment and desire require different intensities and different durations of this purifying process, so that relatively superficial or quickly transient attachments, such as specific food preferences or minor behavioral habits, dissolve relatively easily and relatively quickly, while deeper and more intensely emotionally charged attachments, such as significant addictions or patterns of selfish behavior chronically maintained over decades, require considerable, more extensive, and longer sustained purifying work. Steiner taught that this variation in the intensity and duration of the purifying process explains why certain ancient spiritual traditions, even without the precise technical detail that spiritual science later developed, often described post-death experiences that included elements of purification through symbolic fire or through an analogous process of spiritual combustion. Correct intuition about the real process, even if articulated through more primitively symbolic and less technically precise language. Steiner taught that after adequately completing this period of Kamaloka, with its detailed retrospective purification and its progressive release of the most intensely charged astral attachments, the spiritual self begins the subsequent journey through what esoteric cosmology identifies as different planetary spheres, each corresponding to specific spiritual aspects that require particular work and development before the self can finally achieve the highest encounter with the lords of karma. The first of these spheres, corresponding to the moon itself in specific esoteric cosmology, represents the field where the spiritual self works more specifically with what could be described as hereditary and familial inheritance, processing and understanding, with progressively greater clarity, how one's own physical characteristics and certain specific constitutional predispositions that characterized its recently concluded existence related to particular family lineages and broader hereditary currents that specific existence had inherited and had, in turn, passed on. Steiner revealed that this specific lunar sphere should not be confused with any literal physical location related to the Earth's natural satellite, observable through common astronomical instruments, but rather represents a symbolic and spiritually precise designation for the specific field of consciousness and work that ancient esoteric tradition, through careful observation of the correspondences between celestial phenomena and internal spiritual processes, identified and preserved through these convenient planetary names, yet always requiring deeper understanding than any purely physical literality would suggest. In isolation, Steiner taught that by progressing beyond this initial lunar sphere, the spiritual self subsequently reaches what is identified as the sphere of Mercury, a field where specific work relates more directly to processing and fully understanding how one's capacity for communication, articulate thought, and intellectual relationship with other spiritual selves was exercised throughout the newly completed existence, work that adequately prepares for subsequent, even higher, and even more spiritually demanding stages. Steiner taught that by continuing this progressive journey through the different planetary spheres, the spiritual self subsequently reaches what is identified as the sphere of Venus, a field specifically concerned with the work of processing and fully understanding how the capacity for love, effective relationship, and genuine emotional connection with other beings was developed, exercised, and occasionally compromised throughout the recently concluded physical existence. This particular sphere of Venus involves particularly delicate and particularly significant work, because the quality of love genuinely developed and genuinely exercised during the physical existence relates directly, according to clairvoyant investigation, to the spiritual wealth and capacity for future connection that the spiritual self will carry with it into its own subsequent relationships in later existences yet to come. Steiner revealed that after this work related to Venus, the spiritual self then reaches that which is perhaps the most central and most significant stage of this entire planetary journey, the sphere of the sun itself, the field where the most direct and most fully conscious encounter with the Lords of Karma proper takes place, an encounter that the entire previous journey through the lunar, mercurial, and Venusian spheres progressively prepared and progressively made possible. Steiner taught that this specific correspondence between the solar sphere and the highest encounter with the Lords of Karma is not arbitrary symbolic coincidence, but reflects precise spiritual understanding of how the sun, in the esoteric cosmology that spiritual science articulates, represents the source and center of spiritual force of extraordinary magnitude within the larger cosmic system, a magnitude that appropriately corresponds to the own spiritual magnitude of these extraordinarily advanced supervising entities. Steiner taught that the specific encounter in this solar sphere with the Lords of Karma represents a moment of spiritual quality completely different from any experience that ordinary consciousness, even during its highest and most spiritually developed states, could adequately compare, a moment where the complete totality of the entire evolutionary trajectory of the specific spiritual self becomes simultaneously present and perfectly transparent to this extraordinarily advanced perception that characterizes these supervising entities. Steiner revealed that during this specific solar encounter, what could be described as a moment of synthesis and integration occurs where all the work carried out in the previous stages, from the initial purification of the Kamaloka to the successive processing of the different lunar, mercurial, and Venusian spheres already discussed, converges and is completed in a way that adequately prepares the spiritual self for the final and most advanced stage of this extraordinary journey that is yet to come. Steiner taught that this specific final stage involves progression beyond the solar sphere itself until reaching what are identified as the more distant planetary spheres, specifically Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, each corresponding to spiritual work of a progressively more cosmic nature and progressively more related to aspects of evolutionary development that transcend any purely individual or purely personal perspective already discussed in the earlier stages, closer to one's own just completed earthly existence. Steiner revealed that the sphere of Mars specifically involves work related to how one's willpower and capacity for decisive, courageous action were exercised over the course of a completed physical existence, work that considers not just isolated individual actions, but broader patterns related to how that specific spiritual self typically positioned itself in the face of significant challenges and in the face of opportunities for courageous, morally oriented action. Steiner taught that progressing subsequently into the sphere of Jupiter, the spiritual self undergoes work relating specifically to how its own acquired wisdom and its own broader moral judgment have been developed and exercised throughout earthly existence, considering not simply isolated specific decisions, but the more general and more comprehensive quality of ethical discernment that particular self has consistently demonstrated in its general guidance in the face of the moral complexities that practical life inevitably presents. Steiner revealed that, finally, in the most distant and highest sphere of Saturn, work takes place relating specifically to what could be described as the very fundamental and most essential structure of the spiritual character of the self in question, work that considers deeper and more enduring patterns of spiritual identity that transcend any specific and temporary characteristics related only to that particular recently completed physical existence. Steiner taught that after completing this extraordinarily extensive journey through all these different planetary spheres, each offering its own specific work and its own particular contribution to the larger process of purification and preparation, the spiritual self finally reaches what could be described as the highest culmination of this entire journey, a moment of deeper and fuller communion with the most advanced spiritual hierarchies themselves, including the Lords of Karma, in their most fully developed and most directly collaborative function, relating specifically to the detailed preparation of the next incarnated existence that is yet to come. Steiner taught that the total duration of this complete journey through all these different planetary spheres varies considerably, depending on the characteristics of the planet, specific to each individual evolutionary trajectory, but generally covers a period significantly longer than the duration of the physical existence that has just concluded, often corresponding to entire centuries according to the temporal measurement that characterizes earthly physical existence itself, even though the subjective experience of this period, within the very states of heightened spiritual consciousness that characterize this journey, is qualitatively different from any common temporal perception that ordinary incarnated consciousness could easily understand or easily compare. Steiner revealed that this significant difference between the relatively brief duration of earthly physical existence and the considerably longer duration of this intermediate period between incarnations explains, according to an important cosmological principle that clairvoyant investigation confirms, why the number of spiritual selves currently incarnated on Earth at any particular historical moment represents only a relatively small fraction of the much larger totality of spiritual selves belonging to complete human evolution, because the majority of these selves are, at any particular moment, passing through some specific stage of this extended journey between successive incarnations, rather than being presently incarnated in ordinary, earthly physical existence. Steiner taught that understanding this specific temporal proportion between the relatively brief incarnational existence and the considerably longer period between incarnations helps to adequately appreciate the magnitude and genuine importance of the work that occurs during this intervening period, work that in no way represents a simple interval of passive waiting between successive physical existences, but rather a phase of active and deeply meaningful development that contributes substantially to the entirety of the evolutionary trajectory of any individual spiritual self considered. Steiner taught that there is an important question about how exactly the spiritual conditions of a specific historical epoch, with its cultural characteristics and its particular collective circumstances, can influence or modify this planetary trajectory so detailedly described, a question that deserves careful consideration, because the historical evolution of collective human consciousness itself significantly affects how this specific individual process develops in each particular historical period. Steiner revealed that historical periods characterized by greater collective spiritual openness and greater conscious connection with broader spiritual dimensions typically facilitate a relatively more fluid and more harmoniously integrated journey through these different planetary spheres, while historical periods characterized by more pronounced collective materialism and less social recognition of the broader spiritual reality may, in certain specific cases, create additional difficulties or subtle resistances that make this same journey relatively more challenging for certain specific spiritual selves going through this process during such particular periods. Steiner taught that this relationship between collective historical conditions and individual experience of this journey between incarnations represents one of the reasons why he considered it so urgently important that contemporary humanity develop greater conscious understanding of these spiritual realities that this investigation has carefully detailed, because greater collective knowledge and greater social acceptance of these fundamental spiritual truths could, according to his own perspective, articulated repeatedly in different contexts, contribute significantly to facilitating and enriching this essential spiritual work that every human soul inevitably goes through at some point in its own specific evolutionary trajectory. Steiner taught that this understanding of how collective historical conditions affect an individual's journey between incarnations has additional practical implications related to how any contemporary person can contribute, even during his own present physical existence, to creating more favorable conditions both for himself on his own future journey and for other spiritual selves who will go through a similar experience at some later time. This specific contribution involves, firstly, the very work of personal spiritual development already discussed in previously related contexts, because anyone who genuinely develops greater spiritual openness and greater conscious understanding of these realities during their own present physical existence is simultaneously strengthening their own collective spiritual field that will make this subsequent journey more accessible to both themselves and others, other related spiritual selves. Steiner revealed that this contribution also involves something more specific directly related to the theme of this particular investigation: cultivating, during one's present physical existence, a regular and carefully maintained practice of retrospective reflection on one's own day, or on one's recently concluded week, a practice that, although obviously much more limited and much more simplified than the complete post-death kamaloka experience already described in detail, nevertheless exercises and develops similar capacities for retrospective perception and honest recognition about one's own real consequences that specific actions produced in other beings involved. Steiner taught that this regular practice of conscious retrospection, when maintained seriously and with appropriate honesty over a sufficiently prolonged period, gradually prepares one's spiritual self so that, when it eventually goes through the full process of kamaloka after the conclusion of one's present physical existence, this broader retrospective work occurs more fluidly and with greater relative ease, precisely because corresponding capacities have already been cultivated and have already been exercised, albeit on a considerably more modest scale, during one's own actively and consciously lived physical life. Steiner taught that there is also an important, additional technical consideration regarding how exactly certain specific forms of physical death, especially those characterized by prolonged suffering or particularly traumatic circumstances, can affect the quality and specific duration of this complete path already described in detail through the kamaloka and the different subsequent planetary spheres. Steiner revealed that deaths characterized by significantly prolonged physical suffering, although certainly representing a genuinely difficult experience during the physical existence itself, often correspond, paradoxically, to a relatively faster and more easily completed subsequent process of kamaloka, because the prolonged suffering itself has already accomplished, during the final phase of physical life, significant work of purification and detachment that would otherwise need to be carried out more extensively during the post-death period of kamaloka itself. Steiner taught that, in interesting contrast to this observation, sudden and completely unexpected deaths, especially those that occur without any prior warning or without any opportunity for conscious preparation, often require a relatively more extensive and more carefully worked out kamaloka process, precisely because the spiritual self involved has had no prior opportunity to gradually process its own impending separation from physical existence, thus necessitating corresponding additional work during this specific phase, subsequent to the sudden, unexpected death itself. Steiner revealed that this specific observation about different types of death and their corresponding effects on the subsequent process of kamaloka should not, however, be interpreted as suggesting that any specific form of death would be objectively preferable or objectively more desirable than another, because each specific configuration of death, as well as each specific configuration of life that precedes it, corresponds precisely to the type of experience that that particular spiritual self, in prior collaboration with the lords of karma themselves, had determined as appropriate for its specific evolutionary trajectory at that particular moment. Steiner taught that there is also an important dimension related to how clairvoyant investigation identifies certain specific spiritual practices, especially those related to carefully conducted meditation on one's own personal mortality and on the inevitable transience of all physical existence, as particularly valuable instruments for adequately preparing any person, even during their present existence, for this extensive journey that this investigation has carefully detailed from the initial phase of kamaloka to the complete journey through the different subsequent planetary spheres. This specific meditation on one's own mortality should not, however, be confused with any form of morbid obsession or excessive anxious preoccupation about one's own future death, but rather understood as a mature and genuinely balanced spiritual practice that honestly recognizes the transitory reality of all specific physical existence, while maintaining a broader and more spiritually hopeful perspective on how this same transience relates to an ongoing and deeply meaningful process of development that incomparably transcends any apparent limitations that itself, physical death, might, at first superficial consideration, appear to represent. Steiner revealed that practitioners who develop, through consistent and carefully sustained work over time, this more mature and more spiritually balanced relationship with their own personal mortality, often report not only greater spiritual preparation for the post-death process already described in detail, but also, perhaps even more immediately significantly, a greater quality of conscious presence, and greater genuine appreciation for each specific moment of their own present physical existence, recognizing in this limited and temporally specific existence a precious and genuinely irreplaceable opportunity for spiritual development that no other configuration of existence could ever replicate. Exactly identical way, Steiner taught that anyone interested in beginning to develop, even during their own present existence, this more mature and more spiritually balanced relationship with their own future mortality, could begin with the relatively simple but technically significant exercise of devoting a brief but regular period of reflection, perhaps just a few minutes weekly maintained with appropriate consistency, on the certain but currently still distant reality of their own eventual physical death, without any excessive anxiety or any unnecessary dramatization, but with calm and spiritually mature honesty. Steiner revealed that this specific exercise in regular reflection could include careful consideration of how the totality of present life itself, observed from this broader perspective that includes its eventual inevitable physical conclusion, takes on a different and often more meaningful quality than when observed only from an immediate and completely disconnected perspective from this larger reality that this investigation has carefully detailed. Steiner taught that combining this specific exercise with the previously mentioned complementary practice of regularly looking back on one's recently completed day offers any interested person a relatively simple but genuinely effective program of progressive preparation for the extensive journey that this investigation has described in detail, a program that does not require any prior specialized esoteric training, but only an honest willingness to reflect regularly on those important dimensions of one's existence that ordinary everyday life, with its often absorbing practical demands, could easily make anyone completely neglect without this conscious and deliberately maintained effort over the necessary time. Steiner taught that understanding this complete and technically detailed journey, from the initial phase of Kamaloka with its characteristic retrospective purification to the extensive progression through the different planetary spheres corresponding to specific spiritual aspects, and finally to the climactic encounter with the Lords of Karma in the highest solar sphere itself, fundamentally transforms how any person can comprehend the totality of one's spiritual destiny that extends far beyond the relatively brief limits of any individual physical existence considered in isolation. This more complete understanding, which Rudolf Steiner articulated through decades of extraordinarily rigorous and carefully systematized clairvoyant investigation, offers any contemporary person a detailed and technically accurate map of spiritual process that, although completely invisible and completely inaccessible to ordinary sensory perception, operates with the same objective reality and with the same lawful precision as any physical phenomenon observable through the most advanced, conventional scientific instruments available. Steiner taught that there is also an important additional observation about how this detailed technical understanding of the complete planetary path relates specifically to the question of how different people, even without any prior specialized esoteric training, occasionally report spontaneous experiences that seem to anticipate or reflect partial fragments of this larger journey, especially during clinically documented near-death states or during particularly vivid and particularly meaningful dream experiences. Steiner revealed that these spontaneous experiences, although generally representing only partial and necessarily limited glimpses of this much more extensive and much more complete journey that this investigation has carefully detailed, often correspond with reasonable accuracy to specific aspects of the early Kamaloka process already discussed, especially that characteristic quality of retro-review, perspective of life itself that many people who have had near-death experiences consistently report, regardless of their own specific prior religious or philosophical beliefs. Steiner taught that this consistent convergence between spontaneous reports of near-death experiences and the detailed technical description that clairvoyant investigation offers represents, from his own articulated perspective, valuable additional evidence about the objective reality of this broader process, evidence that complements, without necessarily completely replacing, the very method of systematic clairvoyant investigation that constitutes the most fundamental and technically reliable source of this extraordinarily detailed spiritual knowledge. Steiner taught that another relevant aspect of this convergence between spontaneous experiences and systematic clairvoyant inquiry relates to how different cultures and different spiritual traditions around the world, developing largely independently and disconnected from each other throughout human history, have often preserved partial but recognizable fragments of this same larger cosmological structure, especially through their own traditions relating to the soul's journey through different celestial regions after physical death. Steiner revealed that ancient Egyptian traditions, with their elaborate funerary cosmology related to the journey through different regions of the underworld, and Eastern traditions related to different planes of intermediate existence between successive incarnations, although using culturally specific and significantly different terminology and symbolism from each other, often preserve an underlying structure that corresponds, with reasonable fidelity, to the fundamental principles that this investigation has detailed through the specific planetary terminology that the Western esoteric tradition itself developed and preserved throughout its own centuries of particular historical development. Steiner taught that this broad and geographically dispersed intercultural convergence, far from suggesting simple arbitrary cultural coincidence, significantly strengthens the general reliability of this broader spiritual cosmology, because it suggests that different human traditions, through their own specific methods of spiritual inquiry, developed independently in widely distinct cultural contexts, were effectively perceiving, albeit partially and necessarily limited by their own specific conceptual categories, genuine aspects of the same objective spiritual reality that contemporary spiritual science, through a more systematically rigorous and technically articulated method, has subsequently managed to describe, with greater accuracy and greater comprehensive detail. Steiner also taught that there is an important question related to how children who die at a very young age, before having fully developed the capacities for moral reflection and ethical discernment that characterize common adult maturity, go through this same path already described in detail, an issue that deserves specific consideration because the relative absence of morally complex and deliberately chosen actions that typically characterize childhood could suggest, at first superficial consideration, that the process of kamaloka for such specific cases would be significantly different or substantially shortened. Steiner revealed that although certain specific aspects of this process certainly manifest themselves differently for spiritual selves who passed away during childhood, particularly because there is relatively less complex biographical material for detailed retrospective review, the fundamental work of astral purification and preparation for the subsequent planetary journey still occurs in a genuinely meaningful way, considering not only the specific actions of that particular abbreviated existence, but also broader karmic currents relating to previous incarnations that same spiritual self had traversed at completely different historical moments. Perhaps the most surprising idea in this teaching is that no one would be judged by what they appear to be, but for what it really became. And that raises an impossible to ignore question. If you could see your life from a completely unbiased perspective, what would you see? Rudolf Steiner believed that this question was much closer to spiritual reality than we imagine. If this reflection stuck with you, it's worth checking out the material available at the link in the description and in the pinned comment. Steiner taught that this specific consideration of brief and prematurely concluded childhoods offers anyone who has experienced significant loss related to a specific child additional spiritual context that can help, over time and through a carefully respected and never artificially rushed grieving process, to understand that loss within a broader perspective that recognizes the genuine and deeply meaningful continuity of that specific spiritual self, far beyond the apparently brief limits of that particular physical existence that was prematurely concluded according to any common conventional expectation. Steiner revealed that this perspective, while certainly not eliminating the genuine and completely legitimate pain that such loss inevitably produces for those who remain incarnated, can offer over time an additional source of genuinely grounded spiritual solace, based not on vague hope or simply comforting desire, but on technically articulated and carefully investigated understanding of the objective and deeply meaningful reality that continues to characterize that specific spiritual self far beyond what any perspective limited to observable physical existence could ever perceive in isolation. Steiner taught that the entirety of this detailed investigation into the complete course between successive incarnations, from the initial purifying phase of the Kamaloka to the extended journey through each specifically corresponding planetary sphere, and finally to the climactic encounter with the Lords of Karma, offers to any contemporary person willing to receive it with adequate seriousness not simply intellectual curiosity about abstract and distant spiritual processes, but genuinely practical guidance on how to understand, in greater depth and with greater meaning, the totality of his own present existence and his own spiritual destiny, which extends far beyond any apparent limitation that this specific physical existence, observed in isolation, might at first glance suggest. May each person who receives this extensive investigation into the complete journey between successive incarnations find, in his or her own renewed reflection on these profoundly significant spiritual dimensions, genuine motivation to live his or her own present existence with greater consciousness, greater intention, and greater gratitude, recognizing in it a precious and irreplaceable opportunity for active contribution to the very evolutionary journey that Rudolf Steiner, through extraordinarily dedicated and technically rigorous clairvoyant investigation, revealed as much broader, much wiser, and much more profoundly meaningful than any perspective limited exclusively to this. Only physical existence could ever alone perceive or ever alone adequately appreciate. Steiner revealed, concluding this extensive investigation, that perhaps the most valuable and lastingly significant contribution that all this detailed technical understanding offers is precisely the transformation it produces in any person's everyday relationship with their own limited temporality, revealing in this apparent limitation not a source of paralyzing existential anxiety, but rather a genuine and deeply hopeful invitation to live each present moment with the fullness, with intentionality, and with the conscious love that such broader spiritual understanding always naturally inspires in any heart sincerely willing to receive it. This knowledge, transmitted through decades of extraordinarily dedicated investigative work, remains available to any contemporary person willing to receive it with the seriousness and openness that its genuine depth has always deserved and will always continue to deserve. Steiner taught finally that anyone who sincerely devotes time and attention to understanding this extraordinary journey through the Kamaloka and the different planetary spheres thereafter carries, from this moment of renewed understanding, a valuable spiritual instrument that can accompany him silently through every future circumstance of his own present existence, offering a broader and more deeply hopeful perspective, precisely at the moments where such perspective is most needed and most genuinely comforting. May this understanding, gradually integrated into one's everyday worldview through patient and regularly renewed reflection, serve as a permanent source of mature spiritual guidance, constantly remembering that every present choice, every carefully considered action, and every relationship genuinely cultivated with conscious love contributes in a real and verifiable way, according to all this detailed investigation, to the spiritual richness that will accompany any human self throughout this extraordinary journey, yet to come beyond the limits of this present physical existence. This is, in its entirety, more complete the extraordinary spiritual gift that this carefully articulated investigation offers to any sincere reader willing to receive it with the reverence and openness that such a profoundly significant revelation genuinely deserves. What if the most important moment of your existence wasn't birth, but what happens between one life and another? It was exactly in this direction that Rudolf Steiner took some of his most daring reflections. Because, according to this view, there is an invisible process that determines much more about your next journey than most people realize. If you want to continue this investigation, I left additional content in the description link and also in the pinned comment. Steiner revealed that this type of investigation, conducted over decades with a carefully developed and consistently applied method, represents only a fraction of the much broader totality of spiritual knowledge that he dedicated his life to making accessible for the benefit of all humanity, and that each specific aspect of this detailed cosmology, from the initial stages of the Kamaloka to the complete planetary journey described here, connects organically with other equally important aspects of his broader work, forming a coherent and mutually enlightening system that generously rewards any continued study and any in-depth reflection on its many interrelated dimensions. May anyone interested continue, from this point of renewed understanding, to patiently and sincerely explore the multiple additional dimensions that this extraordinary tradition of spiritual inquiry continues to offer to all who sincerely seek to understand, in greater depth, the broader and more genuinely hopeful meaning of their own existence. Steiner taught that this journey of increasing understanding of one's spiritual nature and of destiny that extends far beyond any single physical existence ultimately represents one of the most valuable gifts that any person can offer to themselves over the course of their own life, a gift that progressively transforms fear into serene confidence, confusion into guiding clarity, and existential isolation into profound connection with a cosmic process far broader and far more lovingly structured than any limited perspective could ever perceive or ever adequately comprehend in all its truly extraordinary magnitude. This remains, to this day, the silent but permanently available invitation that this entire extraordinary investigation offers to each new, sincere reader. May each person, according to their own capacity and their own personal pace of development, find in it exactly what they need to receive at this specific moment in their journey. This is the silent and permanent generosity offered by all genuine and carefully grounded spiritual work, a generosity that transcends any specific temporal limitation and that continues, through the generations, to reach new hearts sincerely prepared to receive it.